Many years ago, Jaywitz released a video in which he details some of his frustrations with the correct way to pronounce Pokémon names. Among these Pokémon is Arceus, or Arceus, or Arceus. As Jaywitz tells us, there are 3 different pronunciations given to us from arguably official sources. He also presents us with one potential method for understanding pronunciations, that being the pronunciation method, as I like to call it. I know, it's genius, it's shut up! But what if I told you that there's actually another method to ascertaining Pokémon name pronunciations? That method is simply the fact that many Pokémon names are taken directly from their Japanese counterparts, and since the Japanese names are naturally going to be closest to the intended pronunciation of the people who created them, finding out how they're pronounced in Japanese should theoretically be the most effective method of determining their correct pronunciation. So to make the case for which pronunciation of the name is most accurate, we first have to learn a little bit about the Japanese language's writing system. The Japanese writing system composes of 3 alphabets: hiragana, katakana, and kanji. Kanji is a demon alphabet Japan imported from China, in which every concept has its own symbol associated with it. Linking them up gives different meanings, and several of the symbols all look alike, including 2 known as Su and Mi. Not kidding, these are 2 separate kanji. And fittingly enough, they sound like what I'm imagining the person who came up with them saying to me in English. If that's not confusing enough, kanji aren't even pronounced the same way in every given scenario. In many cases, you have to somehow know what the pronunciation is based on the context of the sentence. Thankfully, we don't need to learn any kanji for the sake of this video. We're only interested in the first 2. Hiragana and katakana are literally the exact same alphabet with different symbols. Hiragana is the first one kids learn in school. That's why when you see a letter written by a kid in anime, it's always in hiragana. Once you've learned hiragana, katakana is pretty straightforward. You just have to match the hiragana to its katakana equivalents and you're golden. So why does katakana even exist? Your guess is as good as mine, but regardless, it's typically used for names, as well as words borrowed from other languages, such as kamera. The basic premise regarding these alphabets is that they're comprised of the 5 vowels, A, E, I, O, and U, or A, E, O, and U as they're pronounced in Japanese. Following that, you have a series of consonant sounds immediately followed by the various vowel sounds, the most basic being ka, ke, ki, ko, and ku. One of the pitfalls to the Japanese language is that it's a bit more restrictive than other languages. For example, you'll notice that there's no tu sound among the T consonants. We have ta, chi, te, to, and tsu. It is for this reason why I can never spell my name in katakana, and I'm thankful that the Japanese typically refer to each other by their last names, meaning I can simply go by Taikyokutsu if I'm ever in Japan. What the Japanese language lacks in variety though, it makes up for in consistency. One of the frustrations when it comes to learning English is just how many inconsistencies there are. Though, thought, trow, tough, and thorough all have the exact same O-U-G-H spelling, and yet they're all pronounced differently. One of the upsides to Japanese is that it lacks such inconsistencies, at least based on my minimal study of the language. Pretty much the only real exception I can name is the occasional silent U, in which one of the consonants followed by the U sound have the U silent. This is why the name Sasuke is spelled Sasuke, even though it's pronounced Sasuke. But aside from an occasional silent vowel, the consistency of the Japanese language means that you typically don't have to wrestle much with how they're pronounced, if you know how the sounds are pronounced. Words with the sound K will always be pronounced K, they'll never be pronounced Ka or Ki or Ku.
You must be Frieza.
Actually, it's Lord Frieza.
Really? Then why is there an I in it?
There isn't.
As a matter of fact, there actually is technically an I in the name Frieza, it's just that this R-I is always pronounced Ri as opposed to Rai. And another good example of the consistency in pronunciation can be found in the word Pokémon. As you may already know, Pokémon is simply a contraction of the words pocket monster, which in Japanese is spelled Pocket Monster. Since those of us who grew up in the West are typically raised learning the Latin alphabet when we read and write, our understanding of these various sounds comes from what's known in Japanese as romaji, which is a fancy way of saying Japanese words written with Latin alphabet letters. Because the sound A is pronounced so consistently in Japanese, words and names with this sound are often spelled with an accent mark, A, to make its pronunciation more apparent when spelled in Romaji for the sake of languages with less consistency. Examples of this would include the aforementioned Pokémon and names such as Naminé from Kingdom Hearts. Another minor quirk of interest is the occasional lowercase sound. For example, when adding a lowercase su in front of a consonant such as K or T, it causes said consonant to be spelled twice, hence the two T's in Poketo. Additionally, lowercase sounds are often used to modify the pronunciation of a preceding sound. It is for this reason why Dialga's name is pronounced the way it is. As you can see, Dialga's name in katakana is spelled De-I-A-Ru-Ga. Side note, there is no sound for L in Japanese, but since the way they pronounce the R sound is closer to an L sound than it is in our language, foreign words with an L sound are typically spelled with an R instead, which is where the stereotype of Asians mispronouncing L sounds comes from.
You lack discipline!
Nuh-uh, don't lack a discipline!
As you can see here, the lowercase e sound preceding the de sound causes the pronunciation to change to a d sound. Since the d sounds are modified from the t sounds and there is no t sound, instead being replaced by the chi sound, attempting to make a d sound the intuitive way would make it pronounced g. As for why Dialga's name is spelled that way instead of the simple Dai that's used for the Japanese title of the game, your guess is as good as mine. You may also be asking why Diance's name is pronounced the way it is in the dub, since the first part of its name is spelled identically to Dialga's. There's a long-winded and complex answer to that, and it goes like this. The dub got it wrong. Yeah, that's all there is to it. But speaking of Diancie, there's actually another important note regarding its Japanese name. As you may have noticed, the latter part of Diancie's name is spelled C-I-E, which would theoretically be impossible to write in Japanese given that the S section of hiragana and katakana has a shi instead of a C. But as it turns out, there is an explanation for how Diancie's English name can be spelled the way it is, and that is, the English spelling got it wrong. Not quite. You see, at the end of Diancie's Japanese name, there's a dash. This is another quirk of the Japanese alphabet, which leads to the last vowel sound being drawn out, such as A becoming A. But in addition to that, it also has the effect of turning the sounds like shi into more of a tsi and tsu into more of a tu, which is the closest I'll ever get to ever spelling my name in Japanese because gosh darn it, was a tsu sound really more important than a hard tu sound? Moving on. So with all of this in mind, we now have all we need to determine how Arceus' name ought to be spelled in Japanese, depending on which of the three pronunciations is correct. If the Battle Revolution announcer is correct, the name would be spelled Aruceus. If the English trailer pronunciation is correct, the name would be spelled Arukeus. And finally, if the 3D Pokédex's pronunciation is correct, it would be spelled Arukias. And now for the moment of truth. Which of these pronunciations is definitively the correct one? Let's find out!
You failed, stalemate!
Arceus? None of these pronunciations were right? So that's it then? This is the definitive pronunciation of Arceus' name? After all, the name is originally Japanese, so barring cases in which the name was changed in the English version, such as changing Mimi Roll to Baniri, it makes sense that the Japanese pronunciation of the Japanese name ought to be the definitive pronunciation, right? Well, not necessarily. Both J-Wits and the National Dex duo mentioned this pronunciation in their videos, and how it was supposedly based on a trailer of Arceus and the Jewel of Life, but in both videos they claimed that they weren't able to find an English trailer with this pronunciation. Naturally I thought, well, did you check the Japanese trailer? So I decided to take a look at the Japanese version for myself, and you know how I said that the oo sounds are often silent?
劇場版ポケットモンスターアルセウス
彫刻の時空へアルセウスアルセウスアルセウスアルセウス
Yeah, I naturally assumed that the U in Ru and Su would be silent in the Japanese name, but that evidently isn't the case. Additionally, while understanding the pronunciation of the Japanese name can be helpful in understanding how it should be pronounced, it's ultimately just another method of doing so, not the definitive one. If this was the sole definitive way of doing things, not only would we need to pronounce Arceus' name as Arceus, but it'd also require us to pronounce names such as Rayquaza's as Rayquaza. Overall, I'd say this was a pretty interesting thought experiment. It's especially interesting how the one pronunciation J-Wits gave the least credit to actually had the most support for it going off of the Japanese pronunciation. But ultimately, I think J-Wits had it right. Some Pokemon names simply don't have a definitive pronunciation. And as long as people know which Pokemon you're talking about, it ultimately doesn't matter how you pronounce it. That's all for this video. Until next time, see ya!